Take a breath. Get comfortable tonight. We're unlocking a forgotten drawer in history's quiet cabinet. You might not know what's inside, but I promise it hums with stories. Some are whispered behind veils, some hidden in church pews, and others buried in bed linens stitched by candlelight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I don't hear. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a woman in a medieval village, though you wouldn't call yourself that. You wouldn't call yourself anything. Really, names aren't shouted in fields or etched into stained glass unless you've married a knight, birthed a saint, or caused a scandal. And yet your body is not anonymous. It is watched, whispered about, regulated, and most confusingly, never truly yours. Sex for you isn't something you're taught about. It's something you're supposed to just figure out, or endure, or maybe interpret through metaphors, in sermons, awkward references from your mother, or the occasional barnyard parallel that no one ever asked for. You learn by listening, or worse, by living through it. The church says one thing: sex is for procreation, full stop. And not just any procreation, righteous within marriage, eyes closed if possible, and certainly no giggling. According to canon law, anything outside of that risks damnation. So you carry this weight sin on one side, duty on the other, with curiosity tucked somewhere underneath your bodice, hoping not to be noticed. But the body notices. The body always knows. The thing about the Middle Ages that's both surprising and entirely predictable is how many rules existed about female sexuality written by people who knew nothing about it. Monks writing treatises on how women feel during intercourse. Scholars debating whether female pleasure even exists. Spoiler, they often concluded it didn't. Or if it did, it was proof of the devil's trickery. Meanwhile, your experience is much more tangible. Perhaps your wedding night is the first time you see a man unclothed. Or maybe it isn't, because let's not pretend that premarital sex didn't happen. It did. Behind haylofts, in forest clearings after too much cider at feast days. Love, or something shaped like it, still slipped through the cracks of propriety. One truth historians have begun to highlight is how the church's ideal didn't always reflect lived reality. The 12th century penitential texts, basically medieval how-to guides for confessors, include surprisingly specific questions. Did you have intercourse in a standing position? Did you enjoy it too much? Did you dare to use your mouth? Each answer was met with a prescription of penance, often involving bread water, and an awkward number of Hail Marys. And yet, even within this moral maze, people found their way. Sex was not all gloom and guilt. Lovers exchanged poems, scratched initials into trees, or wove flirtation into folk songs. In some parts of medieval France, there were even love courts, where noble women judged the grievances of courtly lovers. You may not have the power to vote, but you might judge whether Sir Guillaume broke Lady Margot's heart. Still, you live in a world where silence is safer. A woman who speaks openly about her desires may be labeled sinful, or worse, cunning. The concept of consent is vague at best and non-existent at worst. Marriage is not an escape from coercion. Often, it is where it begins. And yet, within even the most rigid structures, women carved out slivers of agency. A sigh withheld, a glance redirected, a refusal cloaked as illness. The resistance may be quiet, but it is there. Let's not forget contraception. Yes, that existed too, though not quite the way you might imagine. Women used herbs like pennyroyal, or silphium, now extinct perhaps, due to overuse brewed teas, or inserted sponges soaked in vinegar. Were they effective? Sometimes. Were they talked about openly? Rarely. These remedies were passed from woman to woman, across kitchen tables, midwife beds, and whispered over wash basins. The scholarly debate, well, it centers on whether these practices were widespread or marginal, effective or imagined empowering or dangerous. Some historians argue that the knowledge of the female body was more robust than previously assumed. Others believe it was fragmented, often dismissed by male physicians who insisted the womb wandered like a lost animal if left unsatisfied. Yes, actual theory. The wandering womb was blamed for everything from melancholy to madness. But you know better, or at least you know something. You've watched other women swell with child. You've counted cycles using moonlight and habit. You've seen what happens when power and desire collide in households where affection must tiptoe around expectations. Here's a quirky detail for you. In medieval England, couples who wanted to prove their marriage had been consummated sometimes had to do so in front of witnesses, yes, literally. A curtain might be drawn, but ears were listening, and occasionally so were eyes. How romantic. So much of your experience is wrapped in what is unsaid. You stitch your knowledge into linens. You hum it into lullabies. You pass it on without claiming it. Because that's how knowledge survives in your world, not written in books, but kept in breath and bone. And through it all, you are not just the object of desire or the vessel of airs. You are a woman navigating a maze built without your input, using instinct wisdom and occasionally sass. History may not remember your name, but it remembers the codes you cracked, the borders you bent, and the love, imperfect, curious, unspoken, that you dared to feel anyway. And this is only the beginning. You wake to the smell of barley and old linen. There's light, yes, but not the warm kind that drips through glass. It's thin, shy, early, maybe just past matins if you live near a cloister. Or maybe it's the 5th time you've stirred tonight, belly restless with questions that no priest has ever answered. In this world, the questions you have don't often get answers, not proper ones anyway. What does it feel like? Are you allowed to want it? Are you wrong for not wanting it at all? You ask no one and everyone at once, through glances, hesitations, and half-finished sentences over laundry. The church calls you the weaker vessel, but your body doesn't feel weak. It feels heavy, dense with knowing. A kind of knowing that doesn't come from books, but from experience passed hand to hand, like bread still warm from the oven. It's your mother's look the night before your wedding. It's your friend's silence after her 4th child in 5 years. It's the ache in your hips when no one is watching. Let's talk about the wedding night, since no one else in your village will. Not openly, anyway. In theory, you're supposed to enter that bed, chaste with only God, and fear between you and your husband. But theory and practice, well, they often part ways by the time the 2nd goblet of ale is gone. Some women are married at 12. Some wait until they're 16. It depends on the land, the harvest, and the politics of dowries. But the pressure begins early. You learn to sew before you understand your own spine. You learn how to please before you understand what pleasure even is. Sex on the wedding night is supposed to be sacred. It's also supposed to be proof of what exactly no one explains clearly. But the bedding ceremony is real In some places, neighbors walk you to your room. Sometimes they throw nuts or flowers. Sometimes they wait outside to hear evidence. It's a strange kind of theater where everyone agrees to pretend it's private while also making sure it isn't. And if blood is expected, well, it had better appear. Because if it doesn't, then whispers follow. Did she come to the marriage bed pure? Was it a real marriage at all? These questions carry weight. Your husband might go to the bishop to annul the union, or worse, demand proof of your past. Of course, biology doesn't always cooperate. Not every woman bleeds. But medieval folk don't have Google-only suspicion, and suspicion grows, like mold, quiet, sticky, hard to scrub out. Now, let's talk about pleasure. Or more accurately, let's talk about how no one talks about pleasure. For men, pleasure is assumed. For women, it's debated. Some scholars, men in long robes with dry ink under their fingernails, argue that women need to feel pleasure in order to conceive. Others claim that female desire is a sin, a temptation, a sign of spiritual weakness. One physician says the womb craves warmth, and that intimacy soothes it like a cat curling around the fire. Another warns that too much pleasure makes a woman unruly. So you walk the tightrope. Show no desire, and you're frigid. Show too much, and you're Jezebel. No one wins. Still, you carve out your own truth. Maybe you light a candle just a little later than usual. Maybe you choose the herbs in the stew for their scent, not just their nutrition. Maybe you let your fingers rest a moment longer when folding a husband's shirt, knowing it's the only touch you'll get to control. There's a peculiar detail here. In some regions, women tried to prepare themselves by placing amulets under the bed, or by tying special knots into their hair for fertility. One manuscript even suggests sleeping with a carved stone under your tongue to ease pain and promote cooperation. The line between magic and medicine was blurry, perhaps because neither truly explained your body to you, so you stitched your understanding into rituals. The debate among modern scholars is whether these rituals offered power or illusion. Were they acts of autonomy or desperate superstition? Truth is, they were both. Because in a world where education is closed to most women and your worth is measured by fertility, what else do you have but your own quiet spells? And then there are the midwives. Ah, yes. Midwives, part healer, part gossip, part keeper of feminine knowledge. They're the ones you go to when the blood doesn't stop, when the seed doesn't take, when the bruises bloom and you don't want to explain why. Midwives know things doctors don't, or perhaps won't. Because doctors write in Latin, midwives whisper in kitchens. They rub oils, murmur prayers, apply poultices made from mugwort and rue. They know the slope of your belly before the priest even notices you're glowing. And it's often they who teach you the little you'll learn about sex that isn't shaped by sin or silence. They might mention rhythm, though not in those words. They might show you how to sit after, or what tea to drink before. They might press a hand to your cheek and say something kind which no one else has done since your baptism. And you remember. Because kindness, when it comes to the body, is so rare, it feels like a sacrament. The night goes on. You stare at the beams above your bed, wondering what parts of your body belong to you, and what parts have been bargained away with a ring and a blessing. But still you breathe. Still you dream. And still, in spite of everything, you hope. Because even in a world that tries to make your body a map, drawn by someone else's hand, you find a path of your own. And that's where we'll pause tonight. Not with certainty, but with breath. You'd like to think of the medieval bedchamber as a private place, a sacred place, somewhere to steal a moment, close your eyes, and forget the day's filth, gossip, and plagues. But no, not in this century. Tonight, you slip into a bed you didn't choose, beside a man you might have only met this morning or a decade ago. It hardly matters, because what does time mean in a world where everyone knows your business and half of them sleep just a few feet away? The truth is, in most medieval homes, there's no such thing as privacy, especially not for women. The idea of a private bedroom for just two people, that's a luxury reserved for lords, bishops, or exceptionally lucky peasants. For everyone else, the marriage bed is a strange hybrid, equal parts sleeping space, birthing altar, and sometimes social stage. You hear the sound of breathing around you, your cousin snoring, your mother-in-law whispering prayers, a pig rustling in the corner. The fire's embers cast soft orange shadows on the low wooden beams above you. You're technically alone, but also not. Never quite. And this is the setting for what was often considered the most sacred and paradoxically most public act of marriage consummation. Here's the historical fact of the night. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly under Christian customs, the consummation of a marriage wasn't just expected, it was witnessed. By whom? Oh, just a few close friends. Maybe a priest. Sometimes even a whole party. Helpful, debatable. Awkward, guaranteed. You see, the church was very concerned with whether a marriage was real. It wasn't enough to say vows or sign a contract. What mattered was the deed being done, and done properly, which meant, in some households, the newlyweds would be escorted to bed by their guests. Candles lit. Toasts made. Some even required lifting the sheets to check for blood afterward. A helpful textile swatch, just in case someone needed to argue the validity of the union later. Romantic, isn't it? Now to the quirky detail. Some noble households went so far as to include musicians in the bridal bedroom. Yes, music. To ease the nerves, or drown out the more enthusiastic sounds. Or maybe just because nothing says intimate moment quite like a lute solo from the corner of the room, while Aunt Hildegard watches with a cup of mead. But it wasn't just nobles who faced this. Even peasants weren't exempt from nosy neighbors or midwives with strong opinions about what ought to happen and how soon. And then there's the architecture. Most cottages didn't have rooms plural. There was just the room. One bed, maybe two. Often shared. So unless you timed things very well, say during a festival, when the house emptied out, you were working with an audience. Possibly chickens. In towns, if you had a bit of coin, you might manage a wooden partition, maybe a curtain. But those were more symbolic than effective. Every creak was public knowledge. Every pregnancy became village property. Every miscarriage, every delay in conception, these were mysteries. No one allowed to stay mysteries for long. So you learned to be quiet. Or not. You learn to feign sleep or curiosity. Sometimes you learn to teach the next bride what to expect, though you don't say it directly. You hint. You pass along advice wrapped in herbs and silence. And here's the historical debate to lull you further. Historians still argue about whether medieval people were truly as modest and repressed as some sources suggest, or if they were simply used to a kind of communal intimacy that modern minds find uncomfortable. Some argue that public consummation was more ritual than reality, that it was rarely literal, more often symbolic, a ceremonial putting to bed. But others point to detailed records, especially from church courts, where witnesses describe very specific details of newlywed nights. Who's right? It's hard to say. Memory gets hazy when filtered through candlelight and parchment. But one thing is clear: the idea of sex as a strictly private romantic act is a relatively modern invention. In the Middle Ages, it was a community concern, a duty, a verification step, which brings us back to you. You lie still on the straw-stuffed mattress, trying not to sneeze at the lingering scent of sheep and lavender. The man beside you is quiet, maybe asleep, maybe pretending. Your arm is under your head, the only pillow you'll get. The fire is down to coals. You wonder if someone will mention something in the morning. You hope not. You hope they're too tired from the dancing. You hope the blood on the sheet is enough to silence the questions. You hope someday your daughter won't have to go through this. Or maybe she will. And maybe, if you're lucky, she'll at least get a curtain. You're holding your breath again, not because you're scared, well, maybe a little, but because someone is watching you and you're not entirely sure why. That someone might be your mother, or your aunt, or the midwife who helped deliver your cousin's last baby in the sheep barn. She's been eyeing your step with suspicion all week, like your virtue might be leaking through your shoes. That's the kind of pressure medieval women lived with, the kind that turns walking across a room into a potential scandal. Because in this world, virginity isn't just a state of being. It's a transaction, a value, a legal condition. Tonight we slip beneath the stiff linen sheets of a world obsessed with this invisible thing that's supposed to prove something: purity, honor, eligibility. And most uncomfortably of all, ownership. Here's your historical fact of the night. In many medieval societies, particularly in Christian Europe, a woman's virginity before marriage was not just morally desirable, it was economically necessary. Dowries hinged on it. Marriages were built around it. Land deals, titles, alliances, all shaped by whether a bride was intact. And who got to decide that? Well, not the bride. There was no reliable medical test, of course, no foolproof method, just a swirl of folklore, midwives' opinions, and the ever-dramatic bedsheet. Enter the tradition of blood on the linen. Yes, this again. But this time, it's not about verifying consummation. It's about proving virginity. You see, it was commonly believed that a virgin would bleed upon first intercourse. And while modern science tells us that's far from universally true, medieval logic wasn't exactly big on anatomical nuance. So families took precautions. Some pre-soaked the wedding sheets in blood animal, sometimes even their own. Some bribed the washerwomen to find the evidence. And then there were the superstitions. The old women in your village might tell you to jump backwards 3 times before the wedding night, or hold a sprig of mint between your knees to ensure your virtue stays visible. None of it makes much sense. But in a world where you could be returned to your family shamed unmarriageable if the bed linen didn't cooperate, you do what you must. Now for the quirky detail: in some places, if a bride was found not to be a virgin, the groom could demand his bride's dowry be increased or returned entirely. It was contractual. It was humiliating. It was taken to court. And medieval courts, they were surprisingly interested in bedroom behavior. In some records, judges asked deeply personal and often absurd questions. How much blood was there? Was it bright or dark? Where was it located? Witnesses were brought in. Neighbors testified. It was quite literally a public trial of the private body. And of course, you had no say in the matter. Not really. You were a vessel of proof, not a voice of experience. Here comes the academic debate. Of the night, historians argue fiercely over how widespread and enforced these customs really were. Some say the obsession with virginity was more of a noble preoccupation tied to inheritance and property rights. Others insist that even peasant families cared deeply because a ruined reputation could ruin everyone's chances of climbing even a single rung on the social ladder. There's also debate over whether the blooded sheet custom was truly expected in every marriage or only rolled out for dramatic or political effect. Some regions treated it as symbolic. Others made it practically law. But even if it wasn't universal, the fear was. The pressure was. And that's what matters when we're talking about history, not as events, but as lived experience. So tonight, as you lie on your wedding bed, you're more worried about the cloth under your thighs than the man beside you. You're not thinking about desire or tenderness. You're thinking about friction angles timing. Whether your skin is too dry. Whether someone will come in tomorrow morning and hold up a sheet for inspection like a butcher showing off the day's best cut. You wonder absurdly if you should have eaten more pomegranates this week. Someone once said they helped. No one knows why. And all of this, the shame, the theater, the guessing games, rests on the false belief that virginity is a physical thing. Something you either have or don't. Like a coin in your pocket. Like a certificate with your name on it. But in reality, it's far more complicated. The hymen isn't a reliable marker. Some women are born without much tissue at all. Others tear theirs while riding, climbing, or simply existing. Some bleed, some don't. And none of it says anything about who you are or what you're worth. But try telling that to the parchment men in the courtrooms, the parish priests, the dowry merchants. Instead, you stay quiet. Because in the Middle Ages, silence is the safest defense a woman has. Even when everyone's asking questions she was never meant to answer. The candle sputters beside you. You press your hands to your belly, trying to still the anxious fluttering inside. You wish for comfort, or at least a sheet you could dye red in advance. But most of all, you wish for time to pass. For this moment to be over. For tomorrow to come with its bread, its water, and its 1,000 quiet worries. Because at least then, you'll be back in a world you understand, a world of chickens and chores and small blessings. Not this one, where your body is someone else's proof. Tonight, you're lying on a mattress that's stuffed with straw, lumpy in the middle, and whispering secrets every time you shift. It smells faintly of sheep and old time. You're supposed to be asleep by now, married, bedded, quiet, but your eyes are open, tracing the timber beams above you, while your mind lingers on the words the priest said at the altar, and the ones he didn't. Because let's be honest, medieval marriage wasn't all hearts and songs and dancing in candlelight. It was paperwork. It was property. And once that ring or knot of thread, or even a handshake was sealed, the next step was the bedding, literal and legal. Here's your historical fact of the night. In many regions of medieval Europe, especially under canon law, a marriage wasn't considered truly valid unless it had been consummated. Yes, consummation was the real seal of the deal. It was the part that mattered most in the eyes of the law and the church. Without it, your marriage could be declared null, no matter how grand the ceremony or how beautiful the dress or veil or sackcloth. Now that might sound private, but in this time, privacy was a luxury rarely granted, especially to new brides. Which brings us to the charming tradition of the public bedding ceremony. Yes, that was real. In many households, especially noble or merchant ones, after the feast came the bedding, a procession where family friends and occasionally half the village would accompany the couple to their new bed. There was cheering, toasting a bit too much wine. Sometimes they even tucked you in themselves. And then they left. Or at least most of them did. Because here's the quirky detail. In some cases, a few key witnesses remained just close enough to hear sounds or catch a glimpse to later confirm the act had occurred. Imagine that. Your most intimate moment treated like a business deal with a witness statement. And if something went wrong, if he couldn't, or you wouldn't, or the night passed in silence and separation, there were consequences. You could be taken to court again. Because in medieval society, sex was not just physical, it was contractual evidentiary, and very much everybody's business. And speaking of courts, here comes your academic debate. Historians disagree on just how common these bedding ceremonies were outside the nobility. Some argue it was primarily a performance for the upper classes, where property and legitimacy needed public backing. Others suggest that even among peasants, neighbors might linger a little too long after the feast, listening for confirmation. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. What's certain is that across class lines, a woman's willingness or ability to consummate the marriage could be scrutinized, doubted, even punished. And that brings us to a sobering point. Consent in this context was blurry at best. The idea of a woman refusing her husband was not widely accepted legally or socially. In fact, many law codes, including some ecclesiastical ones, treated a husband's right to sex as near absolute. You, of course, knew better. You felt the discomfort, the fear, the need to survive, to comply, to stay safe. So tonight, maybe you lie still. Or maybe you go through the motions. Or maybe you do your best to disappear into the shadows of the thatched roof, hoping that morning will arrive soon and the questions will stop. There's something almost absurd in all this. Sex, which should be about connection, or at least some level of choice, is instead tangled in proof witnesses and the relentless pressure of family reputation. No one asked what you wanted. They asked if it happened. And that's the difference between story and truth, isn't it? The story they tell is about unity and celebration. The truth is quieter, more cautious. A girl lying next to a man she barely knows, hoping she can guess the right words, to say the right time, to move the right way, to avoid shame. You pull the blanket higher. You think of your mother's hands folding linen with precision, of the other women who did this before you and never said a word, and of the ones who didn't make it through at all. Outside, the wind flutters the rushes by the door. You close your eyes and hope sleep takes you before dawn does, because tomorrow you'll have to smile. You'll have to serve breakfast. You'll have to answer your sister's giggle and your aunt's wink. You'll have to nod when someone asks how the night went. But for now, you're still just a girl under a blanket, hoping that silence counts for something. There's a woman in the village, not young, not old, but somewhere in that soft middle space where her back aches when the rain comes. She's not a nun. She's not a lady. She's something else entirely. They call her the midwife. But she is so much more than someone who catches babies. She knows things, and in a world where knowing too much can be dangerous, especially if you're a woman. She carries her knowledge like a bundle of herbs, carefully wrapped, slightly damp, and hung high out of reach of suspicion. You watch her now as she moves through your neighbor's cottage. She smells of lavender stale smoke and something sharp vinegar or maybe sage. In one pocket, she keeps a string of polished bones. In another, a twist of linen with a paste inside that no one dares ask about. This is your historical fact of the night. In the medieval world, midwives were some of the few women who held accepted knowledge about the female body. They knew the rhythms of bleeding, the signs of pregnancy, and yes, even ways to delay or avoid it. They weren't doctors. Those were men. Latin-schooled robe-wearing and not especially interested in listening to women. But midwives. Midwives listened. And more importantly, they were believed. At least by other women. And while the church both needed and feared them, communities relied on them like breath. They helped with more than births. They helped with bruises, with unwanted swelling, with nights that never led to mornings. Your neighbor had one of those nights. Now the midwife is tending to her, and you've been told to keep quiet. Of course you will. You know what silence is for. Now here's your strange detail of the night some midwives were required to swear public oaths, not just about their honesty or discretion, but about their faith. They had to declare that they didn't use magic, didn't consult spirits, didn't promise cures with charms or chants. They had to walk the line between healer and heretic with the grace of a dancer on ice. Because while the world needed their knowledge, it didn't want to admit how badly it depended on it. Which brings us to tonight's quiet academic debate. Were midwives really respected or merely tolerated? Some scholars argue that midwives were revered, granted space in church records, even consulted by clergy. Others point out the constant threat they lived under, with accusations always one bad rumor away. They were needed, but not always safe. And when it came to sex, well, midwives were the ones who whispered the things your mother didn't say. They taught girls how to tilt their hips to avoid pain, how to check for signs of conception, how to use herbs to cleanse, to calm, to end. Not officially, of course, but unofficially, they were walking libraries. You remember one of them explaining that passion was a fire, and if you didn't want it to catch, you had to keep the kindling dry. You didn't quite understand it then. You might still not. But you did understand her tone, the hush in it, the way the older women leaned in and nodded without speaking. It was a different kind of lesson. The kind passed from hand to hand, from birthbed to fire pit, from one tired body to another. And now it lives in you. You don't say these things out loud, but when someone younger asks, you will. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to carry on the chain of quiet survival, because that's what it was. Survival wrapped in lavender. Survival folded into a cloth pad. Survival stitched into the silence between what's said and what's understood. You watch the midwife leave. She doesn't look back. Her work is done for now. And yours, your remembering, your whispering, your watching, that continues. Because in the end, history isn't just the scrolls and statues. Sometimes it's a woman in an apron with dried blood on her cuffs and nettle tucked behind her ear. And sometimes it's you. You haven't bathed in 3 days, but don't worry, no one around you has either. Your hair is tied back with a bit of ribbon you think once belonged to your sister, and your chemise smells faintly of wood smoke sweat. and if you're lucky, a dried sprig of rosemary pinned near the collar. In the Middle Ages, to bathe was complicated, not because people didn't want to be clean, but because bathing meant risk. Here's your historical fact for the night. Medieval people, especially women, didn't avoid bathing out of laziness. They avoided it out of fear. Public bathhouses, once common in early medieval towns, became sites of suspicion. Disease scandal and even sin were said to steam up alongside the water. By the 14th century, many towns had started shutting them down, and even private bathing became controversial. Because when a woman bathed, especially with oils or perfumes, it raised a different kind of eyebrow. Was she vain? Was she seductive? Was she trying to attract something or someone? It's no coincidence that women who were said to smell too sweet were often viewed with as much suspicion as those who smelled not at all. And that brings us to your strange detail of the night. There were actually recipes meticulously handwritten for vaginal deodorants. Yes, really. Infusions of herbs, soaked sponges, even pressed cloths scented with musk or lavender were used to keep things pleasant, but not too pleasant. A woman smelling of roses might be seen as trying too hard. A woman smelling of nothing holy. A woman smelling of something unnameable, dangerous. So you walk that careful line. You rub sage on your wrists. You chew cloves if you can find them. And when you lie beside your husband, or the man who might soon become your husband, you hope he smells the lavender and not the worry underneath it. Because medieval intimacy wasn't just about touch. It was about breath, about scent, about proximity without saying too much. Which brings us gently to tonight's scholarly debate. Did medieval people really think smell was a sign of morality? Some researchers argue that odor was a deeply moral concept. A sweet-smelling woman was virtuous. A foul-smelling one was sinful, decaying, or even under demonic influence. Others say this is an oversimplification, that smell was more practical than symbolic, tied to health and hygiene rather than judgment. But when you lean over to stir the pot of barley and your sleeve wafts the scent of thyme into your nose, you remember the warnings. Too fragrant, too noticeable, best to stay in the middle. You learned that early. You remember the older women in the village huddling around the water basin, dipping cloths, and gossiping softly about who used rose water and who didn't. You remember the day someone whispered, "She smells too clean," and how everyone suddenly looked at the girl in question a little differently. It was always like that. Too much or too little could both get you noticed. And in your world, being noticed wasn't always safe. So you keep your head down. You lace a bit of fennel into your underdress. You rinse your hands in chamomile when no one's looking. You may not have had a bath in days, but you've kept yourself as clean as one could in every way that mattered. And that in itself is its own kind of seduction. Not one of flash or scent or skin, but of subtlety, of survival. Because in a time when bathing was rare, but suspicion was not, you've mastered the art of smelling like someone just harmless enough. And maybe, just maybe, that's how you stay safe. You blow out the candle. Not because you're shy, but because shadows are simpler than stairs. The fire has gone low. The room smells like beeswax wool and something faintly metallic. Maybe the basin by the wall, maybe your nerves, your husband, or the man who's been called that since the feast, and the priest rests on the straw mattress beside you. His breathing is slow, predictable, not yet asleep. You lie very still. Because even now, even in what they say is the safety of marriage, there's something awkward about the dark. Here's the historical fact that keeps many a medieval scholar wide awake. Most newlywed women were given no formal instruction on sex before marriage, none. No helpful books, no diagrams, no gentle auntie with tea and too much honesty. If you were lucky, you might get a vague warning. If you were really lucky, it came with a prayer. For many women, their wedding night was their first introduction to anything beyond whispers and half sentences. Now, for the odd little detail, did you know some people kept their clothes partially on during sex? Yes, you heard that right. In colder homes, removing everything meant inviting chills, and not the romantic kind. So, shifts stayed, hiked, breeches loosened. Some even used modesty cloths, with slits for well-functionality, offering access without full exposure. You might wonder, was it awkward? Of course. But awkwardness was often safer than indulgence. Desire had to walk a narrow road between duty and danger. Even candles were a question. A lit candle could mean warmth, comfort, perhaps even affection. But it could also be judged as vanity. Too much light, too much sin, and so many rooms stayed dim, not only to save wax, but to save face. Which leads us gently to tonight's scholarly debate. Was medieval marital sex considered an act of love or merely of duty? Some historians argue that love, even affection, bloomed in the candlelight slowly, sweetly between prayers. Others insist it was a transaction heavily prescribed by religion and obligation. The church, after all, spoke often of procreation, rarely of pleasure. But when you lie there in that hush between expectation and rest, you wonder, can something be both? Can duty carry traces of tenderness? Can affection exist quietly, without fanfare, in a room where the ceiling leaks and the neighbors hear everything? You turn slightly pretending to sleep. You count the cracks in the plaster. You remember what your mother said, or maybe what she didn't say. And then there it is, a touch. Not bold, not brutal, just there. A weight on the blanket, a shift in the mattress. You breathe, slow, even, still. Because even in a world where love is rarely named and affection hides in practical gestures like mended sleeves and lentils cooked just right, there is still this. The closeness, the attempt, the quiet. Tomorrow no one will ask how it went. They'll simply assume. You'll get nods, winks, maybe a few poorly sung jokes from someone's uncle at the well. But the truth of what happened in the dark, that stays with you. You'll tuck it under your sleeve beside the dried mint and go on. Because medieval women didn't just survive the physicality of marriage, they endured its silence. They became experts in decoding breath-reading pauses, interpreting the rustle of linen. And sometimes, just sometimes, they learned to find softness where no one expected it. You stir in the night. Not because of dreams or aches, or the cold breeze from the cracked shutter, but because you remember something someone once said. Even in your own bed, God is watching. That thought lingers, not just as metaphor, but as medieval reality. In this world, morality doesn't wait politely outside the bedroom door. The church, broad-robed, bearded, and occasionally red-faced with contradiction, had opinions. Lots of them. About when, how, why, and even how often you and your husband should share a bed, which days were holy, which positions were permitted, which thoughts even could tip you toward sin. Here's your historical fact. The church taught that marital sex was acceptable, but only within strict boundaries. It must be between husband and wife, with the intent to procreate, and ideally without too much enthusiasm. Pleasure suspicious, desire potentially dangerous, enjoying it too much. Well, now you're practically asking for penance. In fact, some penitential manuals, the how-to books for confessors, laid out very specific punishments for misusing marital sex. Days of fasting, public prayers, even restrictions on what kinds of food you could eat after certain acts, and the list of prohibited days. Let's just say it left very few options. No sex during Lent, or Advent, or Sundays, or the eve of a feast day, or a Wednesday, or a Friday, or if one of you had sneezed too dramatically in church that week. Okay, maybe not the last one, but it was close. Now, for the odd detail, some devout couples actually kept a written calendar to track allowed nights. Imagine that. A little wax tablet tucked in a chest beside the flax and rosary beads. Tonight, no. Tomorrow, only if it rains. But here's where it gets quietly complicated. Despite all the rules, all the finger-wagging medieval people were still people. They laughed, they gossiped, they got bored. And yes, they found ways to bend rules in private. So we arrive tiptoeing at our scholarly debate. Did women internalize these religious teachings to the point of fear, or did they quietly reinterpret them, claiming small freedoms within the confines of doctrine? Some argue medieval women bore a heavy burden of guilt shaped by sermons and saints. Others suggest they learned to nod along while carving out their own forms of agency, like lighting a candle after the priest had gone home. You roll over. You glance toward the corner where your prayer beads hang. You wonder, not for the first time, whether faith and desire can truly share the same roof. Because the truth is, many women didn't have the luxury to rebel out loud, but they did in quieter ways. In whispered jokes to a friend, in the way they paused before extinguishing the light, in the moments when affection was allowed to bloom, even when not officially sanctioned. So tonight, you lie in your straw bed, next to a man you may love, or may simply endure. You think of the saints, the sermons, and the silences, and then you think of something warmer, not sinful, not shameful, just human. Because medieval women carried religion on their backs, but sometimes they also set it down for a moment of peace. You press your palm flat against the embroidery hoop, tightening the linen just enough to feel the tension hum beneath your fingertips. Tonight's thread is red earthy, not bright, dyed with madder root and weeks of careful soaking. You thread the bone needle slowly, rhythmically, the way your mother taught you, the way her mother likely taught her. This is not leisure. This is labor, dressed as decoration. The candle beside you flickers as if it too is exhaling from the day. You're not alone. A younger cousin works beside you, humming softly, her stitches crooked but sincere. The fire behind you has turned to quiet orange rubble. The house sighs and wooden creaks. Outside, a dog barks, once, then stops, as if even that noise was too much effort. Embroidery is praised as feminine artistry, but in truth, it's one of the few ways women have to speak, to scream without making a sound. You don't stitch roses just to be pretty. You stitch a bird caught in thorns, because you're not allowed to say how trapped you feel. You thread a single drop of blood between petals and call it a design. No one will question you. That's the beauty and the heartbreak of it. You were never trained in letters. No formal schooling. No ink to your name. but your hands have learned to tell stories on cloth. Every flower you place is a word you're not permitted to say aloud. Every border is a boundary you didn't choose, but are forced to respect. Tonight's work is a scene, a small cottage, a tree, and a figure, just one, bending low with a basket. Your cousin asks if it's St. Elizabeth. You nod. But in your mind, you know it's you. Here's a historical truth. They don't always teach embroidery wasn't just decor. In many medieval convents, noble houses, and even rural homes, women used needlework as a form of communication, encoding prayers, lamentations, even political commentary in the folds of altar cloths, veils, and linens. It was a secret language, one decipherable only to those who had lived the same silences. There's a particularly strange anecdote about a noblewoman who embroidered her entire confession line by line into the lining of a bishop's robe. No one noticed until years later when the fabric wore thin and the Latin began to bleed through. But you don't have fancy Latin. You have petals and borders and thorns. There's an old debate among scholars, actually, about whether women's embroidery counts as literature because it lacks permanence, because it doesn't use real words, because it's soft domestic. But there's a growing number of historians who argue that yes, it is literature. It is autobiography, just one made with thread instead of ink. After all, what is a diary, if not a record of what you weren't allowed to shout? You stretch your back, then lean forward again. The candlelight pools in the curve of your hoop. The linen is warm where your hand has pressed it. It smells faintly of the chest where it was stored lavender dust, a hint of something sour. Your cousin has fallen asleep against her sleeve. You don't wake her. This kind of quiet is rare, precious. You remember a time when you stitched a border too tight. The cloth puckered, and no matter how you tugged it, refused to lie flat. You thought it was ruined. Your grandmother only laughed. It's the fault line, she said. Let it be. Every life has one, so you left it. Now, years later, you include a deliberate pucker in every piece you make, not for beauty, not for mistake, but as a signature. You think about the girls who came before you, those who stitched in castles, in cloisters, in candlelit kitchens like this one. Did they know that someday someone might hold their work up and ask, who made this? And no one would know the name? Did they care? Or was it enough to know they made it? You stab the needle down again, this time with more purpose. The figure under the tree now has a halo. Not because she's a saint, but because you want her to be seen. Because you're tired of being invisible. Outside, a light wind rattles the shutters. You welcome the sound. It feels like company. The hearth crackles again, a last puff of heat, before turning in for the night. You place your finished hoop on the table and blow out the candle. In the darkness, your fingers still trace the threads, reading your story by touch alone. Tomorrow no one will ask what you dreamed of, but you'll remember anyway. And the cloth will too. You wake to the smell of vinegar. Not the sourness of spoiled food, but the sharp sting of boiled herbs, steeped in cider used to scrub down everything from pewter plates to pustules. It's your turn to clean the sick room, or what passes for one. A straw mattress, a cracked basin, and a jug of water infused with whatever someone foraged last week, marjoram if you're lucky. Dandelion and wormwood if you're not. The house is quieter than usual, which is always a bad sign. Silence means something's gotten worse. You wrap a scarf around your nose, not because it'll help, but because it makes you feel like you're doing something. and step into the dim alcove where your aunt lies curled, sweaty, and shivering. She's not old, not really, but the seasons have been cruel. Too much rain, not enough bread, a neighbor's cough that turned into something else, and no doctor. You are the doctor today. Well, doctor is generous. You're the caretaker, the cleaner, the herbalist, and the one who will have to say, it's time if it comes to that. You learned it all from observation. Your grandmother, with her bundle of dried sage. Your cousin muttering prayers, while crushing juniper berries. The old widow, who swore by tying leeks to the wrists. It's not science. It's survival. The cloth you use to wipe her brow is soft but frayed. You hum a lullaby while you work not to comfort her, but to keep your own hands from shaking. In your world, illness isn't dramatic. It's lingering. It's quiet. It doesn't need to knock on the door. It's already inside, sleeping in your bed, borrowing your breath. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In medieval Europe, women, especially those without noble status, were the primary medical caretakers. Midwives, healers, herbalists, mothers. Most never trained in a university, weren't allowed to read Latin, and yet carried centuries of empirical wisdom in their hands. They passed knowledge not through books, but through practice prayer and whispered remedies. You pour warm broth into a wooden cup, raise her head gently, and offer a few sips. She swallows. You exhale. A small victory. Now, a curious detail urine was considered a powerful diagnostic tool in the Middle Ages. Physicians and women too often examined its color, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste. Don't flinch. It was practical. Medieval urine charts were tools of the trade like stethoscopes today. Yours is less glamorous, a glance into a chamber pot and a long guess. You think of a time last year when a child in the village had a fever. A passing friar insisted on prayer. You brought honey and thyme and cool water. The child lived. The friar left. No one thanked you. But the child smiled. That was enough. You change the linens. You speak softly. You wait. And while you wait, you worry. There's a debate ongoing even among modern historians about whether women's healing practices in the Middle Ages should be considered medicine or folk magic. The line was blurry then, and it still is now. Some say it wasn't science if it lacked formal study. Others argue that experience was the study, and that to dismiss these women's work is to erase a vast body of female knowledge that kept countless people alive. You tend not to care what the scholars think. Your aunt's breathing has steadied. You light a second candle just for her. Then you do something you rarely allow yourself. You sit. The weight of responsibility doesn't lift, but it shifts. You tuck her hand under the blanket, your own hands, raw from lye and hot water. The vinegar smell has seeped into your skin. You don't expect praise. You don't expect recognition. You expect only this: to be tired, to be needed, and to be invisible. But tonight, you allow yourself one small wish that someone someday will understand the work women did in the shadows of sickbeds, with no title, no payment, and no promise, just care. Because love in your time is rarely said aloud. It's boiled, steeped, wrung out in cloth, and offered one trembling sip at a time. The fire has burned low, and your hands are stained again, this time, not with blood or broth, but with soot and beeswax. You're making candles, not the elegant kind that nobles light for their feasts. No, yours are short, squat, and smell faintly of tallow, with a wick that sometimes sputters out halfway through evening prayers. but they're enough. Enough to read a psalm, enough to sew a patch into a tunic, enough to see your way through one more long night. And tonight, you need the light. Your mother's hands used to move like this careful, practiced, never wasting emotion as she dipped each wick, let it cool, then dipped again. You learned by watching. You still hear her voice in your head, slower, straighter. Don't waste the wax. You remember how wax was scraped from the bottoms of half-used candles and pressed into new shapes, melted and poured again and again. Nothing went to waste, not even light. Here's your historical fact. For tonight, candles were precious in the medieval household, especially for peasants. Most homes relied on daylight or the glow of the hearth. Candles, whether made of tallow, rendered animal fat, or beeswax, were made sparingly, kept for long winter evenings, births, deaths, or urgent mending. Light was a luxury. Darkness was the default. And yet somehow, women like you turned scraps of wax into warmth. You hang the new candles from the rafters to dry. Your apron sticks to your skin. You haven't eaten since midday. But before you do, there's one more task your neighbor has asked for help with her daughter's hair. Lice again? They're as regular as moon cycles and far more stubborn. You wrap up the finished candles, tie them with string, and bring them over. The girl is small, maybe 6. Her hair is thick matted from sleep and soot. You sit her near the window and begin. You work with comb and oil, and a patience you didn't know you still had. She tells you about a dream she had, about a goose who turned into a fish and stole a loaf of bread. You listen, hum in agreement, and keep combing. Now a curious detail in medieval times. Many believed that lice were a sign of holiness, especially when found on hermits or saints. To suffer vermin was to suffer like Christ. There's even record of certain holy women refusing to remove their lice, calling them pearl drops of humility. You, however, do not feel particularly saintly as you squash one between your fingernails. Still you smile at the girl and say, "All gone." She beams. You tuck her hair back with a strip of cloth. One less irritation in a life already full of them. Back home, the candles are dry. You light one, just one. There's a quiet debate among scholars about how much light medieval people really lived with. Some say most peasants were in the dark, literally, for nearly half their lives. Others argue that between moonlight, firelight, and simple ingenuity, they adapted better than we give them credit for. But you know, the truth lies somewhere between. You've seen what one candle can do. You set it by the window, not because you need to see, but so someone else might. A passerby, a child, a neighbor, afraid of what the night holds. You sit down at the table and unwrap a crust of bread. It's hard, nearly a weapon, but you soften it in broth. Chew slowly and watch the shadows shift across the walls. You've always known that women like you lived between dark and light. Not saints, not sinners. Just steady hands making candles, braiding hair, wiping foreheads. You never expected a statue in your honor. But maybe, just maybe, you deserved a candle. And tonight, you let it burn all the way down. You're kneeling in the dirt again. But it's not prayer this time. Well, not the church kind. This is the earthy, aching kind of devotion. You're digging up onions. They're small this year. The ground was stingy, the rains late, and the pigs got into the lower bed. You pull each one, gently brushing off clumps of soil with the edge of your sleeve. The sun is nearly gone now, barely more than a brass coin slipping behind the trees. and the onions, wrinkled a bit weepy, still smell like survival. In the medieval kitchen garden, onions were queen. They kept through the winter. They flavored everything from pottage to medicine. They even earned a spot in medieval love magic. An onion tucked under the bed could tell you if your suitor was faithful. If it sprouted crooked, so was his heart. You drop one such lumpy specimen into your basket. Crooked indeed. Here's your historical fact. The medieval diet, for most people, was humble, repetitive, and built around whatever grew close to home. Onions, leeks, cabbages, and turnips were the backbone. They filled empty bellies during Lent, soothed coughs with poultices, and warded off spirits, so it was said with their pungent charm. But here's the strange detail. In some medieval texts, onions were considered aphrodisiacs. Monks warned each other not to eat too many, lest they stir impure thoughts. Imagine that temptation in a bulb. And that brings us to tonight's quiet debate. Were medieval women truly as modest as the surviving records make them seem? Or were they simply written that way through the pens of male scribes, monks, and moralists? If an onion could be scandalous, what else was lost in translation? You lift your basket, creaking at the knees. The path home is slick with fallen leaves. The air smells of wood smoke and damp moss and the faint iron tinge of rain. Inside, the hearth is still warm. You toss a log onto the coals and set the basket down like it's filled with treasure. In a way, it is. You peel one onion and your eyes water. Of course they do. No matter how many years you've done this, it still gets you. It's not the crying that bothers you. It's that you can never quite tell whether it's from the onion or from everything else. You start supper, a bit of barley, a pinch of salt, that onion sizzling in the pan, like it's telling you secrets. You stir, taste, adjust, and think of how many women before you stirred this exact kind of meal, century after century, quietly feeding everyone else first. Dinner is eaten in silence. You're not alone, but no one speaks. Not out of coldness, but weariness. This is a house that's worked hard all day. Even conversation feels like a luxury sometimes. When the bowls are empty and the fire low, you return to the garden with a lantern. One last thing. You kneel again, this time in a patch of mint. You crush a few leaves between your fingers and breathe deep. Clean, sharp, bright enough to cut through onion tears and long shadows. They say medieval women didn't have time to think, didn't have education, didn't have voices, but you know better. They thought while they cooked. They remembered while they weeded. And they spoke in whispers, in glances, in the quiet language of who got fed first and who got the last of the onions. The garden hums with frogs now. The moon slips between clouds like a secret being passed. You head inside a sprig of mint, tucked behind your ear, not for fashion, not for healing, but simply because it makes you feel like you. And tonight, that's reason enough. Your mother didn't write manuals. Neither did your grandmother. And yet their teachings linger pressed like petals between the pages of your life, even if those pages are unwritten. Tonight, you're sitting near the hearth again, stitching quietly, not for necessity this time, but because the needle has become a kind of metronome. The fire pops every so often, like a punctuation mark in a sentence no one's brave enough to say aloud. Outside, someone's yelling about a pig, but you barely flinch. You're too focused on something else the words women leave behind without ink or scroll. They live in gesture, in glance, in a perfectly timed cough. When you say you're thinking of marrying that flax-haired lad from 2 villages over, this is how it worked in the Middle Ages. Sex education wasn't written. It was embroidered into conversation, hidden in metaphors, so sly they could escape the ears of priests, but still reach your cousins. Common sense. Historical fact for tonight. There were no formal guides for women on how to have sex, at least not from the church. You got sermons about chastity hymns, about virginity, and vague warnings about goats. But the women, they had their own library, not made of parchment, but of pauses, of knowing looks, of stories disguised as cautionary tales that began with, "Well, when I was your age." You're remembering one now from your aunt with the raspy voice. She once said, "If his hands smell like onions, don't expect poetry." It made no sense then. It makes perfect sense now. The curious part is how medieval women couldn't say much, and yet managed to say everything. An apron folded a certain way. Bread baked a little too early. The sudden decision to fetch water at the same time every evening, just as a certain field hand passed by. The oddity, these codes were often more effective than the written kind, because if you wrote it down, it could be found. And if it was found well, you might suddenly be labeled a heretic, or worse, a temptress. Let's pause and pick at the thread of something both quirky and revealing. The concept of chaste belts. You've heard of them, perhaps. A locked contraption of iron meant to guard a woman's virtue, except they're likely a myth, a fabrication of later centuries, or at best, a satirical idea taken too literally. Museums have a few, yes, but most are now believed to be Renaissance-era joke pieces or fakes. Yet the image sticks. Why? Because it's easier sometimes to imagine iron and keys than to acknowledge something more complex, that medieval women lived under social restraint far more effective than any metal could ever be. And yet inside that restraint was subversion. A smile that said, "I know." A lullaby that wasn't quite about babies. A bath shared with a sister-in-law who whispered things the priest would faint over. So here's your debate tonight. Did the silence around sex make medieval women powerless? Or did it make them more creative? Scholars lean both ways. Some argue that the lack of access to knowledge bred fear and submission. Others say it cultivated a deep well of female intelligence, coded symbolic, but no less powerful. You lean toward the second view because you've seen it, heard it, felt it in the way the older women speak in riddles. Never outright saying yes or no, but telling you all you need to know between the lines. Tonight, one such riddle rings in your ear again. If you don't like the way he sharpens knives, you won't like the way he asks for bread. Was that about cooking? About violence? About intimacy? Yes. The lesson wasn't just how to survive. It was how to read a world that refused to write itself clearly for women. So when someone asks you later how you learned, you'll say, from a lullaby, from the way she peeled apples, from the time she told me to never trust a man who whistles while washing his feet. These weren't just idle sayings. They were survival manuals, spoken softly, embroidered into daily life, preserved in gesture. Tonight, you wrap yourself in that wisdom like a second cloak. It's warm, it's familiar, and most of all, it reminds you that even when voices are silenced, they can still echo cleverly, stubbornly, tenderly, between the threads of history. And tomorrow, when you rise and fold the linens, just so someone younger will notice, she'll ask why, and you'll smile. Just makes them last longer, you'll say. But what you mean is watch, learn, remember. Because you were never handed a book. You were handed a life. And inside that life were the footnotes of every woman who came before you. The henhouse is quiet now, save for the occasional sleepy cluck from a feathered conspirator. You're out here not for eggs, but for a moment to breathe. Because inside the cottage, your aunt and your sister-in-law are exchanging stories. Again, stories. You're technically too young to hear, but old enough to understand. This is how education happens. Not in classrooms, but in kitchens and behind bread ovens. Not through books, but through bodies. Lived bodies. Stories lived in skin and scars and whispered laughter. Tonight you're thinking about your own body, how little it belonged to you in public, yet how much it mattered in private. In medieval times, your body was everyone's business. The church said it should be hidden. The law said it should be controlled. And your neighbors? Well, they had opinions too, loud ones. Let's unwrap one of the most persistent facts in many parts of medieval Europe. Women could not legally consent. That is, marriage itself was considered lifelong consent. After the vows, you didn't have much say in the matter. What was his became his, and what was yours, well, was also his. But here's where it gets peculiar. While women were taught to be passive, the church also expected them to be available, not just for procreation, but for the husband's relief. And if she refused, well, theologians debated whether that was a sin. Not his, of course, hers. So your body is caught in a theological riddle. Say no, and you risk spiritual failure. Say yes too often, and you risk social judgment. Let's fold in a quirky detail that never made it into most history textbooks. The medieval belief in the wandering womb. Yes, many physicians at the time believed that a woman's uterus could physically move around her body, causing hysteria, fainting, or general unpleasantness. The cure: marriage. And more precisely, intercourse. It's not funny, not really. But it's also not surprising in a world where women's health was treated more as mystery than science. Still, this myth allowed some women to argue that desire, and not just duty, could be part of the equation. That is, if your womb wandered, you might be permitted a bit of indulgence for your health. There's a debate here, humming beneath the candlelight. Did women use these myths to gain a bit of bodily agency, even within a restrictive system? Or did these stories simply reinforce the idea that women were unstable medically and morally? Some scholars argue that these notions gave women space, albeit strange and symbolic, to express desire without punishment. Others say it was just another leash disguised as care. Back inside, the women are laughing now. Someone's mimicking a priest's awkward sermon about the dangers of female pleasure. It's oddly freeing, this irreverent moment, because even though most women were never given permission to speak plainly about sex, humor made it survivable. You remember one saying from an older widow in the village: pleasure is like honey. Too much, and they call you a bear. Too little, and they wonder what's wrong with your hive. It didn't make sense when you were 10. Now you chuckle, because medieval women weren't supposed to enjoy sex. At least not publicly. But privately, the record is murkier. Some confessions and court testimonies hint at affection, even joy. Women describing their lovers with phrases like, "He pleased me more than bread," and in an age where bread was survival, that's no faint praise. Of course, these records were rare, because most women didn't get to speak, or write, or be remembered. But in the small details, a recipe with too much saffron, a song with one too many verses, you catch glimpses of a hidden world. A world where pleasure, though policed, still found its moments. And let's be honest, there's a quiet rebellion in enjoying something you're told not to. Tonight you tuck that thought under your cloak like contraband. You carry it past the henhouse and into bed, because tomorrow someone might ask why you're smiling at nothing, and you'll say, "Just thinking about honey." They won't ask further, And that's the point. The truth about medieval sex isn't just in the rules or the punishments. It's in the cracks, the sideways glances, the laughter at sermons, the second piece of cake you weren't supposed to want. Tonight you feel all of it. Curiosity, sadness, wonder curling around you like the smoke from a banked fire. And when sleep comes, it's not just rest. It's a soft archive, a place where all the unwritten stories settle, waiting to be remembered again. You've lost count of how many faces you've fed. Some had your nose, some had your neighbor's frown, some didn't look like anyone in the village, but they cried the same and needed milk just as urgently. You never asked too many questions. In the Middle Ages, questions were luxuries like silk or teeth. Instead, you opened your door, or your lap, or your cupboard, because that's what women like you did. You carried the generations that weren't yours too. There's always a child on the floor. Not always yours. Sometimes it's your cousin's daughter, or a neighbor's orphan, or the son of a woman whose husband vanished into the forest last spring and never came back. You make room. You find them a bowl. You add a bit more water to the stew. No one makes announcements about this. No parchment decree. No monument. But if you ask around, everyone knows which homes take in the forgotten. Yours is one of them. Historically, medieval village records only bothered to name orphans when they became a burden on the parish. But before that, they were passed from woman to woman, like bread torn but still warm. Here's the historical truth. Informal fostering was an invisible backbone of peasant survival. Without it, half the children born in a bad harvest year wouldn't have seen spring. You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because the world doesn't give women the power to change much. But it can't stop you from saying, "Stay, I'll take care of you." Sometimes the child you raise doesn't even call you mother. Sometimes they leave when they grow strong. But the quiet part, the part no one sees, is the way they always come back when their own child is sick. To ask softly, "What did you boil when my chest was tight?" Or, "Do you remember the words you whispered when I had fever?" And yes, you remember, because that's another thing no one writes down. But everyone knows a woman's memory is longer than her lifespan. You still remember a girl who stayed with you one winter. She wore a red ribbon and cried in her sleep. You never asked why. You just wrapped another blanket around her. Some wounds don't want light. They want bread and breath and someone to stay awake while they fall asleep. Now here's your curious detail. Some medieval women kept a list of names in the folds of their aprons. Not saints, but children they'd once cared for. They weren't biological children. They were survival children, memory children, children of war, plague, abandonment, or just bad luck. And some scholars debate whether this qualifies as a kind of feminine archive, a lineage without blood, written in soup and lullabies. There's no church record for how many lives you saved, but you remember, and so does the kettle, and the patched cot, and the lullaby with half the words forgotten. You've learned how to love quickly, efficiently, like lighting a fire with one match and no kindling. Because in the medieval world, children die often, but they laugh just as often, and it's the laughter you cling to. Like the baby who tried to eat a beetle and looked so proud, or the boy who called you mum for the first and last time on a summer afternoon. You were shelling peas. You didn't cry then. You just smiled, kept shelling. Tonight, as you settle near the fire, there's a child curled up beside you again. Not yours, but yours in all the ways that count. And outside, the wind claws at the shutters. But inside, there's warmth. And the kind of silence that isn't lonely. It's full. It hums. You don't expect thanks. You don't need it. Because in this house, under this roof, through this life, you've carried more names than any book. And though the world may not remember you by statue or song, it remembers you in bodies that survived and in hearts that learned what safety feels like. You're sitting near the hearth again, though this time there's a sense of anticipation in the air, not yours. Necessarily more like the kind that clings to stories when people are about to talk about things. They usually don't. And what's tonight's story? Well, it's about secrecy, silences, and the mysterious subject of same-sex love among medieval women. It's easy to assume the Middle Ages had no room for anything outside the narrow band of sanctioned male-female unions. But you know better by now. You've learned to peek behind veils into the quiet folds of life that didn't get written down unless someone disapproved of them loudly enough. Imagine you are a woman living in a world where almost every part of your body and soul is owned by someone else. A husband, a priest, a landlord, or maybe just tradition itself. But friendship, that's one of the few places where you can still breathe. And sometimes, that breath deepens. There are records you see, though, sparse and usually tinged with suspicion, of intense female bonds. Letters between nuns that border on poetry. Church court cases, where women were accused of using implements in ways that the authorities found troubling. Love cloaked in the language of devotion. Desire hidden inside the fabric of spiritual friendship. Here's the historical fact of tonight. There were medieval laws and trials that criminalized sexual acts between women, though they were far rarer than those involving men. And when they did surface, they were often met not with fire, but with confusion. Some courts didn't quite know what to do. Was this really sex, could it be? Or was it just women being, well, emotional? And here's your odd detail in some texts. Women accused of same-sex acts were said to grow a masculine part to perform intercourse. Now, this wasn't science, it was more of a moral metaphor, or perhaps a panic response. But it does tell you something fascinating about how gender and sex were misunderstood and mythologized. The medieval mind couldn't always imagine a world where pleasure didn't need a man. There's a debate, of course, among historians. Were these women actually lovers in the modern sense? Or was the language of love and intimacy simply different, then more tender, more physical between friends than we allow today? Could they lie together in shared warmth, kiss each other's hair, and still mean nothing more than sisterhood? Or was it more? You crouch near the coals and think of two peasant women laughing over ale in a village darkened by curfews, or two nuns sharing a tiny bed in a stone cell too small to separate their thoughts. The records are quiet, but the silences are loud, and what a relief it must have been if you were a woman living in a world of duty and fear to find someone who didn't demand but simply listened, who saw your body not as property or proof of fertility, but as a being with breath humor, mystery. Medieval Europe didn't have our language for queerness, not in the way you'd recognize, but it had longings. It had stolen glances. It had handwritten notes, smuggled in pockets, and hearts that beat harder for reasons that made no reasonable sense. And if a woman loved another woman, well, sometimes the world never found out, and sometimes it did, and wrapped the whole affair in fear or laughter or something in between. But always, always, there was a fire burning under it, all the fire of longing, of wanting more than what the world allowed. You lie back on your straw mattress now, letting the hush of the room settle around you like a blanket. You don't know their names, those women, but that's the thing about history. What it loses in names, it sometimes preserves in echoes. You can still feel them whispering through time, reminding you that love has always found a way, even in the dark, even behind convent walls, even when the history books forget. You're scrubbing a linen shift against the cold stones by the river, and the light is low, casting long shadows that don't quite match the rhythm of your hands. The stream gurgles as if gossiping, and perhaps that's fitting, because tonight, the story is about reputation, about what people thought you did, what they said you did, and how in the medieval world, perception could matter even more than truth. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned: the medieval obsession with appearance. Not fashion, not lace and fur, and elaborate headdresses, though those had their place, but the way a woman's sexual morality could be inferred from how she walked, how she spoke, or whether she smiled too often at the wrong person. In towns and manors alike, your reputation clung to you like smoke. It followed your footsteps into the baker's stall and trailed behind you in church. A single accusation, however small, however vague, could turn your world to ash. Here's your historical fact for the night. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in England and France, women could be charged not only for committing sexual transgressions, but for seeming to. The word scandalous had real legal weight. Common woman, lewd behavior, familiarity with men, all could be grounds for public punishment, even without proof of any act. And what did that punishment look like? Well, here's where things get odd. In some towns, women deemed morally suspicious might be forced to wear special garments, a hood of shame, a painted sign, or even a horned cap meant to signal watch out, this one misbehaves. Others were sentenced to sit on the cucking stool, dunked repeatedly in cold water to cool their passions. Public shaming was not just a consequence, it was the point. Now, for your quirky detail, in some regions, being too clean was suspicious. Bathing frequently, yes, we're circling back to hygiene again, was seen as a sign you might be preparing for illicit meetings. Clean hair, well scrubbed skin, perfumed oils. Clearly, you weren't doing that for your husband, especially if he was away fighting a war or sleeping off ale in the corner. You must be up to something. And so, a woman caught washing too often might be whispered about, or worse, dragged before the town court and asked to explain her intentions. And this is where the debate begins. Was medieval society more obsessed with purity than with the actual behavior? Did the idea of a woman being available matter more than whether she truly was? Scholars still argue about whether these social punishments reflected widespread sexual repression or simply the community's need to control female autonomy. Because that's the root of it, isn't it, control? A woman with a spotless apron and lowered eyes was trustworthy. A woman who dared to laugh loudly or walk alone or wear color well, that could unravel everything. Respectability wasn't just about staying within the lines. It was about being invisible in the right ways. And perhaps most painfully, other women were often the ones doing the watching, the whispering. It wasn't always men with torches. It was neighbors' sisters, even mothers, who reminded you that virtue was a team sport, and if one woman strayed, the rest paid the price. You wring out the linen and set it to dry your hands red from the cold. In a world where bathing could be a political act and clean fingernails sparked rumors, how did anyone manage to survive, much less thrive? You kept your head down. You walked carefully. And when you did love, when you did risk your reputation for a moment of warmth or desire, you learned to keep it quiet. The wrong smile could cost you everything. But silence at least couldn't be used as evidence, at least not always. You're plucking lice from a woolen blanket by candlelight, your fingers moving slowly, rhythmically, as if following a tune only your grandmother knew. The flame flickers, casting tall shadows against the wall. And you think, half amused, half resigned, how much of medieval life was about pretending. Pretending the blanket is clean, pretending the food is warm, pretending the world doesn't know what you've done or haven't done. Tonight we drift into the uneasy realm of proof, or rather the lack of it, because in the Middle Ages, when it came to a woman's sexual life, proving anything was a slippery, squirming thing, especially for women, who were often presumed guilty of secrets, even when they had none to confess. Let's begin with your historical fact. The concept of virginity testing existed in various parts of medieval Europe. It wasn't standardized, and it wasn't scientific. If anything, it was a mix of folklore guesswork and wishful thinking. A bride could be examined by older women or midwives before marriage, her honor weighed by vague signs, a tight hymen, a cool and dry body, or even the tone of her voice. It sounds absurd, and it was, but it shaped real lives. And here's the kicker, even if the tests proved her chaste, it didn't mean much if her husband said otherwise. In some cases, particularly in elite circles, noblemen could annul marriages by simply claiming the bride wasn't a virgin. No evidence necessary, just disappointment, pride, or a shift in alliance. Here's your quirky detail. Some women, fearing humiliation or rejection, actually faked blood on their wedding night. A sponge soaked in animal blood, a cut on the thigh, a dark berry smeared in the right place. These were whispered tricks passed down by women who knew too well the stakes. A stain on the sheet was not just symbolism, it was protection. So now we arrive at the question scholars love to argue over. Was virginity truly a physical condition or a social performance? Did people believe the body told a story, or did they write the story first and twist the body to match? Because think about it, you could be untouched and still shamed, or you could be a widow, a survivor of assault, or someone simply unwilling to speak and still be judged by what someone else thought your body should have been. It gets murkier still. Some theologians argued that true virginity was of the soul, not the flesh. A woman who repented could be as pure as one who'd never known a man. Others scoffed and said, nice idea, but try telling that to your future husband. And in that awkward gap between religious mercy and social reality, medieval women had to walk a very fine line, tightrope thin, and always above a pit of suspicion. You smooth the lice-bitten wool and drape it over the stool. The wind whistles under the door, cold enough to remind you there's no comfort here, only survival. And when it came to intimacy, the survival strategy was not always abstinence. Sometimes it was silence, sometimes it was acting, and sometimes it was simply making sure no one ever saw the truth, whatever that was. You blow out the candle. In the darkness, everything feels safer. And that in itself says a great deal. You're sitting on a stool near the hearth again, this time minding a pot of something vaguely soup-like. It's mostly water, a turnip, and hope. The fire crackles lazily. The wood too damp to do its job properly, but at least it keeps your hands warm. Tonight, the quiet wraps around you like a cloak. And in that hush, you start thinking again about what secrets women carried in this world and which ones they never meant to. Because if you're going to talk about medieval women and sex, you can't skip the most complicated layer of all pregnancy. Let's start with your historical fact. In the Middle Ages, pregnancy was not simply a biological event, it was a deeply social one. A woman's body, once pregnant, was no longer her own. It became a vessel for inheritance, for legitimacy, for scandal, for proof of virtue, or betrayal. And the moment a woman's belly began to round, the whispers started. If she was married, people speculated about the timing. Had she become pregnant too soon after the wedding night? Had the math added up? Or was it suspiciously fast? If she was unmarried, it was worse. Every glance became a question, every neighbor a judge. But here's your odd little detail. Some women faked pregnancies. And no, it wasn't always for deceit. Sometimes it was desperation. A noble woman trying to hold her position in a household. A widow clinging to an inheritance. A young bride fearing rejection. They used padded cloth-tightened belts beneath their dresses and timed their labor to coincide with a quiet disappearance, perhaps claiming a stillbirth, perhaps just returning to life as if nothing had happened. This leads to your scholarly debate. How much control did medieval women really have over their reproductive stories? Some historians argue that midwives and older women formed informal networks of support, quiet hidden systems that helped young women navigate pregnancy, abortion, or concealment. Others insist this is reading too much agency into a system that more often than not punished female sexuality in all its forms. But the truth is, the historical record is full of gaps, some carved out by time, others by shame. You don't often find parchment scrolls where women plainly explain how they slipped fish scales into their beds to fake miscarriages, or where they confided in a sister about the way their belly swelled with fear rather than life. But the stories existed, passed down in kitchens, in stables, in whispered prayers. And when it came to sex, pregnancy was always the looming consequence, both biologically and morally. There was no privacy once a woman began to show, and no forgiveness if the wrong person believed the wrong story. So tonight, as your soup barely simmers and the shadows flicker against the uneven wall, you think about all the women who learned to shape their own narratives, not because they were liars, but because the truth was never safe. You stir the pot, it doesn't get thicker. But then neither did most medieval stews. Still you survive. You always do. You're sitting on a stool near the hearth again, this time minding a pot of something vaguely soup-like. It's mostly water, a turnip, and hope. The fire crackles lazily, the wood too damp to do its job properly. But at least it keeps your hands warm. Tonight the quiet wraps around you like a cloak. And in that hush, you start thinking again about what secrets women carried in this world, and which ones they never meant to. Because if you're going to talk about medieval women and sex, you can't skip the most complicated layer of all pregnancy. Let's start with your historical fact. In the Middle Ages, pregnancy was not simply a biological event, it was a deeply social one. A woman's body once pregnant was no longer her own. It became a vessel for inheritance, for legitimacy, for scandal, for proof of virtue, or betrayal. And the moment a woman's belly began to round, the whispers started. If she was married, people speculated about the timing. Had she become pregnant too soon after the wedding night? Had the math added up? Or was it suspiciously fast? If she was unmarried, it was worse. Every glance became a question, every neighbor a judge. But here's your odd little detail. Some women faked pregnancies. And no, it wasn't always for deceit. Sometimes It was desperation. A noble woman trying to hold her position in a household. A widow clinging to an inheritance. A young bride fearing rejection. They used padded cloth, tightened belts beneath their dresses, and timed their labor to coincide with a quiet disappearance, perhaps claiming a stillbirth, perhaps just returning to life as if nothing had happened. This leads to your scholarly debate. How much control did medieval women really have over their reproductive stories? Some historians argue that midwives and older women formed informal networks of support, quiet hidden systems that helped young women navigate pregnancy, abortion, or concealment. Others insist this is reading too much agency into a system that more often than not punished female sexuality in all its forms. But the truth is, the historical record is full of gaps, some carved out by time, others by shame. You don't often find parchment scrolls where women plainly explain how they slipped fish scales into their beds to fake miscarriages, or where they confided in a sister about the way their belly swelled with fear rather than life. But the stories existed, passed down in kitchens, in stables, in whispered prayers. And when it came to sex, pregnancy was always the looming consequence, both biologically and morally. There was no privacy once a woman began to show, and no forgiveness if the wrong person believed the wrong story. So tonight, as your soup barely simmers and the shadows flicker against the uneven wall, you think about all the women who learned to shape their own narratives, not because they were liars, but because the truth was never safe. You stir the pot. It doesn't get thicker, but then neither did most medieval stews. Still, you survive. You always do. The wind hasn't let up. It sighs through the cracks in the wall like a tired old woman who has seen too much. You pull your shawl tighter and shift your seat closer to the fire. The flame barely keeps up. You're not sure which is slower tonight, your soup, the fire, or your own drifting thoughts. You've heard stories from the older women mostly, about herbs and whispers, oaths, and old wives' tricks. But one thing they all agree on when it comes to sex and medieval women: knowledge wasn't passed down in books. It was folded into bread dough, hidden in embroidery, breathed between women while rinsing laundry by the stream. And so let's talk about that knowledge, specifically about how medieval women tried against all odds to understand their own bodies. The historical fact, tonight, in many medieval households, women were their own physicians. Formal medical texts, when they existed, were mostly written by men for men in Latin. But women, especially midwives and older matriarchs, had a deep, practical knowledge of female health passed down through experience, not scrolls. One of the quirkiest records we have, a 12th century remedy book that casually recommends using roasted earthworms and honey as an aphrodisiac, and another that suggests tying a frog around your left thigh to prevent pregnancy. No one said it was effective, just imaginative. But here's the real debate. Were these folk practices superstitious nonsense, or were they a grassroots form of women's science? Some historians argue they were dangerously uninformed. That reliance on charms, amulets, and symbolic gestures reflected a tragic ignorance of anatomy. Others defend them fiercely, arguing these remedies were pragmatic, sometimes surprisingly effective, and most importantly, they represented the only medical care most women ever received. You lean back, thinking about the old woman who once pressed a warm poultice of lavender and garlic to your stomach and whispered something about the moon. You didn't understand the words. You're still not sure if she did either. But the pain lessened, and you remember her eyes, how certain they looked, even if the world doubted her. So perhaps that's the thread running through all of this: medieval women didn't just survive by obeying the rules. They survived by passing secrets from hand to hand, by sharing knowledge in places no man thought to look, in kitchens, in gardens, over bleeding herbs and soft-spoken spells. You think about the women who wrapped dried rosemary in their skirts before going to bed, or the ones who carved protective runes into the bottom of their wooden shoes. Tonight, the world outside your cottage feels vast and cold, but the fire still crackles, and your grandmother's old remedy tucked beneath your pillow still smells faintly of sage and hope. The embers are low now, casting a soft red glow across the stones. You sit with your knees tucked under your chin, listening to the pop of the last wet log in the hearth. A faint chill sneaks in through the floor, but you're too wrapped up in the quiet to care. There's something comforting about this silence, like the world finally decided to whisper instead of shout. And it's here in this hush that we come to the last question, the one that lingers even after all the others have been stirred and folded away. What did it mean to be intimate as a medieval woman? Because yes, we've talked about anatomy and taboos, midwives, and ritual sin and soap. But beneath all that, beneath the linens and litanies, there's something deeper, and that's connection. The historical fact for tonight's final chapter is this: while most medieval marriages were arranged and transactional, there is recorded evidence of genuine affection and even occasionally love. A woman named Marjorie Paston, writing in the 15th century, penned letters to her husband that read more like modern romance than medieval obligation. She worried about his health. She told him not to forget his gloves. She missed him. The quirky detail: some couples would send each other small charms, embroidered hearts, smoothed pebbles, sprigs of hawthorn as tokens of longing. Not everything was sermons and suspicion, but the scholarly debate is more complex. Were these tender moments rare exceptions, or have we simply not looked hard enough? Most preserved records, after all, were written by men, monks, nobles, priests, none particularly keen on recording the emotional lives of women. And so historians argue, has the softness of medieval love been erased not by time, but by a lack of interest? You don't have to decide. That's the beauty of quiet thinking. Instead, you imagine a woman not so different from you, sitting beside her own fire. She's just finished brushing her hair, a wooden comb resting nearby. Her husband lies asleep beside her, snoring lightly. She could wake him, but she doesn't. Instead, she watches the flames and hums a tune her mother used to sing. It's not a grand moment, but it is intimate, and that's the truth that doesn't always make it into scrolls sometimes. The most sacred closeness was found in the mundane. A shared blanket, a touch on the wrist, a secret smile across a busy market. Medieval women may have had little control over their lives, but they found ways to carve out meaning within the cracks. They laughed, they teased, they held hands under the table when no one was watching. And in those small moments, they stitched something lasting, threads of memory, of resistance, of quiet joy. You stretch your toes toward the last of the fire's warmth and feel a calmness settle. The story doesn't end, not really. It just folds into the dark like all the best ones do. The fire has gone out now. Only soft smoke lingers, curling like a sigh into the beams above your head. You're still there, wrapped in a wool blanket, your thoughts heavy and slow, but in a comforting way, like dough rising under linen. Tonight's story wasn't a fairy tale. There were no crowns or dragons, just women. Ordinary, extraordinary women, sitting at the edges of history, whispered about, often overlooked. And yet they lived. They worried. They waited. They stitched joy into silence. They found laughter where no one thought to look. They made space for tenderness, even when the world told them not to. And though their names might be worn thin by time, their feelings weren't. Those linger. The truth is, history doesn't always come wrapped in banners or written in bold ink. Sometimes it hums beneath the surface, in bathwater gone cold, in a touch that meant more than words, in the way someone held their breath when they weren't supposed to care. You've heard those hums now. You've followed the threads, and you've made it to the end, not just of the story, but of the day. So let the weight of all that quiet knowledge settle into your bones like warmth from a long-forgotten sun. You don't have to remember every detail. You only have to know that you were here and that you listened. That sometimes is all the past ever wanted from us. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.